Hey guys, it's the Melblade 5, and after a long period of dwelling on what to do next, again, I was recalling my playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom earlier this year, and how one part of the game I found to be on the weaker side was its dungeons, due to their simpler structures and objectives compared to many of those that came before. This made me reminisce on the dungeons from previous games, what I enjoyed about most of them, and how they always stuck out in my mind as some of the highlights across the Zelda series. From there, the inspiration struck me, and I began to formulate the countdown on which of these dungeons are my favorites. With there being so many dungeons across the series, it was not exactly an easy task to whittle it down to just 10, even less easy on how to rank them, because a lot of them have at least one aspect to them that I find memorable in a positive sense that had me considering their inclusion on the list. So ultimately, I found it best to combine all those recurring aspects to make the list's criteria. That being the layout, theme, atmosphere, puzzles, item, and bosses. With those that resonate with me stronger, obviously contributing to higher placements. And while I didn't restrict myself with an only one per game rule because it would have forced me to leave out some other dungeons I really like, I did try to not have too many from one game appear to prevent it from feeling repetitive. Though as we get higher up on the list, that statement becomes more questionable. So while I simultaneously pine for the possibility that the next fully open-world Zelda game could have dungeons designed more like those that have come before, I'll go over my top 10 favorites of said dungeons. In spite of its intentions of being a successor to A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds equivalent of its predecessor's locales are often regarded as inferior, for lack of a better word. But I'm not exactly of the same opinion as others on this, with one such area in Worlds I find to be notably superior being the Dark Palace. As opposed to Past's Palace of Darkness, this dungeon I think stays a lot truer to its name, which is displayed through its theming and how it impacts the gameplay. From the beginning, most of this dungeon is cloaked in pitch black darkness, with many torches scattered around for you to light up to reveal your surroundings. One of your standard dungeon features. But what makes me really like this dungeon is how it puts a spin on that common trope, as unlike others with similar aesthetics, you use darkness as your ally. There are a bunch of rooms with walls, floors, and markings that you can only see when it is dark. Meaning that to best traverse this dungeon, you have to switch between the light and the darkness all Ikaruga style, where the need to have one over the other can switch at a moment's notice. Thus, there are times where you have to actively blow out the torches in order to best progress. Something almost unheard of in a Zelda game. Just the concept of having something that is normally a danger assist you instead is one I find very interesting, and I really like how they executed that idea for the most part. In the same vein, they also did a few unique things with the non-light dark-based puzzles. With the item for this dungeon being the bombs, there are still some simple blow-up-the-cracked-part puzzles, but there are also a few based around throwing bombs at the right time or with fast reflexes. Alongside some cool methods of traversal via wall merging they managed to fit in here too. Yet on the other hand, while I do like its unique elements, Link merely adopted the dark. He wasn't born in it. So I also feel like those elements, and especially the light and dark switching, weren't utilized quite enough for my liking. I would have loved to have seen it come up more and mixed with other types of puzzles too. Even the boss battle against the Gemasaur King is a more simplified version of the Helmasaur King fight. There's quite a bit of untapped potential here, so if they ever had a similar idea for a future, ideally larger dungeon, I'd be all for that. Since Majora's Mask's focus and lasting appeal was on its world building and side quests over dungeons, most of its dungeons don't really stick out in my mind when I think about the game. At least not in good ways. But somewhat of an exception to that is present in the last of the 4 main dungeons, the Stone Tower Temple. Definitely being the one I remember the most. Just reaching this place is almost like a mini dungeon in of itself. Then once you're inside, since Ikana is the only region that doesn't have its own transformation mask, a fact that will always bother me, it instead acts as a proving of your mastery over all the transformations, with there being a few interesting situations where you're required to use abilities across multiple transformations to solve puzzles. combined with some instances where you have to use them alongside the Elegy of Emptiness to make those creepy statues. However, the main reason why this temple stands out more to me than the others comes in its second half after getting the light arrows, where you have to leave the dungeon and shoot this jewel by the entrance to flip the whole dungeon upside down. Now you must traverse over what was formerly the ceiling, with many of the rooms altered by this shift in gravity to reach areas that were previously inaccessible. This is such an insane concept that has never been seen elsewhere to this extent. And even with how trippy everything looks upside down, it's not a pain in the ass to play through, though you do have to use some unconventional methods to get around. Then all this insanity gets capped off in an equally insane way in the twin mold boss battle, with the most effective way to deal with them of using the Giant's Mask in its only usable instance to make Link gigantic and just unleash brute force on them until they're dead. Such a ridiculous way to fight against what is, ironically, the least memorable boss in the game for me. Honestly, I find the Gomez mini-boss more memorable. It kinda makes me wish they just buffed him and made him the boss instead. It would actually fit a lot better with Ikana's vibe too. And that's pretty much the one thing holding this dungeon back for me. Despite being the one I remember the most from Majora's Mask, certain aspects like the similar looking rooms still create a mishmash of memories from it that don't properly connect to one another. But what I do actively remember, I remember very fondly. Across the series, there have been a couple of oddball games here and there that slightly mix up the standard Zelda formula as a one-off. And to a lesser extent, Minish Cap falls into that area for me due to being one of the few original games to not be developed by Nintendo. But Capcom and Flagship were still able to capture the spirit of the dungeons found in the 2D games while still making things fresh for this entry. And one of the prime examples of that would have to be the Palace of Winds. Right off the bat, this is one of the very first sky-themed dungeons in the series, long before they became more reoccurring. And this dungeon was certainly a good introduction. This dungeon surprisingly places a lot more emphasis on platforming than what you'd usually see, by having to navigate over a lot of bottomless pits with many gimmicks and hazards to aid and impede said navigation respectively, in ways to still keep it interesting. Even a good chunk of the puzzles in this place, like those that require Link's copies, have a strong focus on your movement for each room. This is all further enforced by the dungeon item being the Rocks Cape, the item that allows Link to jump and glide, which, of course, is not only used to jump up to higher altitudes, but its gliding ability is frequently used in tandem with the aforementioned gimmicks for Link to make it across large gaps. Then in contrast, the latter half is set in more of an indoors environment and takes more of your standard 2D dungeon approach. So there is still some familiarity present rather than becoming a far cry from the norm, even if I do find this part to be a bit too rudimentary for my liking. And though this dungeon is certainly on the longer side, from my own experience, I've never had much trouble when it comes to finding your means to progress, as I found that doing some simple wandering around the rooms will often take you to the small keys needed to unlock the next door. So I think it manages to be a fair challenge, one that is capped off by one of the trippier bosses in the game with the Georg pair. Two flying stingrays where you have to jump back and forth between the male and female and multiply to attack the female's eyes. It's not a hard fight, but the perspective can get a little weird when the male flies over for your time to jump. But all in all, by the time I've completed this dungeon, I get the feeling they left a good foundation for Sky Dungeons going forward. Wind Waker is another game that is a little lacking when it comes to the number of dungeons featured, also due to placing a much greater emphasis on its overworld, but they definitely made up for that with quality over quantity, as I find every dungeon in this game to be both enjoyable and memorable in their own ways. But for the one I'd say sticks out the most to me when I think of this game, that would probably be the Earth Temple. As opposed to what you'd initially expect this dungeon to be based on the name, this one has the spooky theme. It's actually a giant catacomb filled with many of the creepy and undead enemies, alongside numerous set pieces to fit alongside its settings, such as the many coffins enemies can pop out of. The somewhat eerie atmosphere this temple generates did a decent job of making me feel on edge on my first playthrough to juxtapose Wind Waker's usual tone, especially during the quieter sections, as I'd half expect something to pop out at me. So of course, your main method to combat these obstacles is to use the light, this time going one step forward than with similar puzzles in the series. For this dungeon, you have Medley traveling with you, and can even take control of her using the command melody. On top of being able to fly both on her own to reach high places and when Link carries her to make it over large gaps, Medley can use her harp to reflect the light at the required target. And once Link gets the mirror shield later on, you now have 2 characters to reflect light with. This expands upon the uses of the mirror shield seen in other games by having Link and Medley team up to solve the light reflecting puzzles, which creates new ways in which to make the light reach its target, or have multiple targets or additional components to the puzzles to flesh them out more. I consider this dungeon to have the best utilization of the mirror shield, with the one downside being the fact that it can get very tedious having to play the command melody over and over again. As for the boss, we have Jalhalla, a giant Poe made out of what appears to be the ghosts of the Teletubbies, mimicking Boolossus from Luigi's Mansion, but it's really fun if you have the hurricane spin to annihilate so many Poes when he splits apart. So combine the creepy but well-executed theme with some well-executed puzzles and a fun boss fight, then you get a good recipe for a memorable dungeon. Then on the flip side, there's the re-dead screams. This will be a very strange Zelda countdown if it didn't have any appearance from Ocarina of Time, the original game to be hailed as the pinnacle of the series. As the first of the 3D games, it laid some tremendous groundwork for dungeon designs in that third dimension for future entries to build upon. And I think a fitting one to make it onto the list would be one that encapsulates the spirit of the game, the Spirit Temple. What helps this dungeon excel, even amongst the others from Ocarina of Time, is its unique structure, with it being split into 2 halves that is centered around the game's primary mechanic and theme. For the first half, you have to play as young Link through an overall simpler layout compared to the other Sage Temples, but still facing against some of the tougher enemies you've only ever fought as adult Link, including an Iron Knuckle for a mini-boss. This half is a great introduction for everything that the Spirit Temple is about. Its uniqueness through having to be young Link for a Sage Temple, in addition to its puzzles that utilize certain mechanics that have hardly or never been seen up to that point, and its challenge from being the last of the standard dungeons through young Link's more limited equipment and being outclassed by the enemies. Then once you get the Silver Gauntlets, you switch back to Adult Link and can now progress as him to start the second half of the dungeon, which is less challenging in the enemy department now that you're on more equal footing again, but makes up for it by building upon its peculiar puzzles from what was established before. Now using a decent amount of Adult Link's equipment from prior dungeons, and later having its own light-based puzzles that are executed differently as you progress. Building towards how the proper item for this dungeon is the Mirror Shield again. Though it doesn't get used that much here since you get it pretty close to the end. But its utility does get a bit more fleshed out for the Twin Rover boss fight, having to reflect their magic attacks towards each other to harm them, if you can get past the stiff aiming. Then once they fuse together, the Mirror Shield can now store their magic to shoot back after absorbing 3 shots of the same element to leave them open for a thrashing, when they eventually use 3 of the same. But ultimately, a fitting send-off to this dungeon's qualities that cements it as a perfect challenge before the final stretch. Ah, Skyward Sword, the Marmite of Zelda games. But unlike Marmite, I'm on the side that likes it, since, while not perfect, does do well in almost every aspect that matters, which obviously includes the dungeons since I think they nail most of them on both gameplay and atmospheric levels, with one of the greatest showcases of that being the Sand Ship. The time shift stones were one of my favorite mechanics in Skyward Sword, both conceptually and in execution, of being able to transform an area to how it was in the past, and then switch back and forth between the two to find ways to progress. And the Sand Ship follows up on how the stones were used in the prior visit to the Lanayru province to an insane degree. This dungeon, coincidentally, also has a form of duality to it based around time periods, as after you get the bow from defeating the mini-boss Skirvo, a robot pirate, you can now strike the time shift stone at the top of the mast to morph the entire ship to how it was in the past, which creates a huge shift in how you traverse this place, as now some areas are accessible due to the reactivated machinery, but others become impassable. So through convenient bars that allow you to shoot from below deck, you have to hit the stone repeatedly at various points to switch between the two time periods so you can solve puzzles and progress, placing a strong emphasis on that duality throughout your whole exploration. This is also the point in the list where we start to get to dungeons that I think really excel in the setting department. Phantom Hourglass had already done a pirate ship dungeon, but the sand ship still has its own unique feel to it that helps it still stick out. Not only through being a mechanical ship and the time shift stone present, but also the sense of personality it gives off from its lore. This is Skipper's ship that had been stolen by Skirvo and continued sailing even after Lanayru became a desert. Just the journey of reaching the ship is already engaging with the whole mystery of where exactly the ship is, and there's even a little side story of having to save Skipper's crew so they can help you. This world building really gives the dungeon a much livelier presence on top of the already cool premise that helps you get even more invested in playing through it. Then there's the boss, Tantalus, who is like the butt of all jokes for Zelda bosses. I think the escape sequence and premise of a kraken attacking the ship is cool, but the fight itself is pretty simple. At least it's over with fairly quickly. I'm slowly starting to realize that it's the desert dungeons that appear to be consistently some of the best in each game, as we now have the third desert dungeon in a row, and ending this trend with what I find to be the most memorable of them all, the Arbiter's Grounds. The desert theme is self-explanatory, but what already makes this place so memorable from just the surface level is how it combines that theme with the spooky theme. Not only is this place teeming with the undead enemies like Stalfos and Redead Knights, it also ties into its setting, which involves some of Twilight Princess's darkest pieces of lore. This is an abandoned prison that was previously used as a means for Hyrule's most dangerous criminals to be imprisoned, tortured, and executed, as well as being where the Twilight were held before being banished to the Twilight Realm. That context and how it is reflected through the dungeon's aesthetics and hazards generates a very unsettling vibe when you think about all those undead enemies and spirits located here. These eerie feelings are only strengthened by the events that you see while making your way through here, or to be more accurate, what you can't see. One of the more well-known parts of the Arbiter's Grounds is how at certain points, Link's movement will become sluggish, and when you switch to your wolf form and turn on your senses, get this shit off me! There's also a repeat of the Forest Temple where you have to track down and kill 4 Poes to move forward, which also requires your wolf senses to track down and fight them, but most of all, without a doubt, is the build-up to the mini-boss. You find an empty room with nothing but this huge cleaver tied up with exorcism talisman attached to the ropes, and after cutting it loose, the sword starts floating. So, once again, using your wolf senses, you reveal Death Sword. And now you have to fight whatever this demonic creature is. Afterwards, the mood starts to lighten up a bit when getting the spinner, letting you become Tony Hawk and perform sweet trick jumps across this haunted prison, having what you learned be put to the test against the boss, Star-Lord, which is probably one of the most fun bosses in the game, especially in his second phase where you gotta use those trick jumps in rapid succession to both dodge and stun him in such a high-speed battle. With the long-lasting impression left by its setting, combined with the fun and unique item and boss fight, is why this is commonly seen as one of the game's highlights. Fortunately, the quality of Twilight Princess's dungeons does not stagnate following the Arbiter's Grounds. If anything, I find the dungeons to overall get better and better from there. And that is only proven by this next dungeon, which, funnily enough, just happens to be the very next dungeon in the game. The Snow Peak Ruins. As soon as you reach this place is when you see one of the biggest reasons why it is so memorable for me. Its concept. This isn't some sort of ancient temple or even traditional ruins despite the name. It's simply a run-down mansion that is now inhabited by Yetis. It's such a unique setting for a dungeon that also feels more modern without feeling out of place in Hyrule that makes it stand out so much in the best possible way. I love the semi-laid-back atmosphere of this dungeon while still keeping you on your toes with its dangers. Unlike other dungeons, this place has safe rooms, in front of the fireplace with Yetta and the adjacent kitchen with Yetto, so you can get a moment of respite from all the ice monsters elsewhere, a healing point by taking some of Yeto's soup like a potion, as well as being a location you have to repeatedly come back to receive new objectives. Since Yeta can't remember where the bedroom key is, you end up on some wild goose chases to get food. But every time you report back to her, you give this food to Yeto for him to add to his soup, which makes it recover more hearts, further adding to that laid-back feel. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, a few of the enemies like Chillfoss can be a bit of a challenge to fight. That is, until you get the ball and chain that allows you to demolish everything in your path. In fact, a lot of the puzzles revolve around destroying things in one way or another. Except for this block pushing puzzle that is the low point for me, since it takes me prolonged trial and error every single time. Similarly, the boss, Lizetta, while having a good concept of Yeta being possessed, is one of the easiest bosses with a simple solution to beat. So she kinda just comes and goes. But those two downsides are almost a non-factor, since everything else about this dungeon is executed so well and is so unique that they are what stay with me when I think back on this dungeon in possibly the strangest episode of MTV Cribs ever. Now it leaves me wishing they could think outside of the box more for future dungeon concepts. Returning to Skyward Sword, as is the case with the game's design, we find a dungeon that not only goes a step above in the gameplay and atmosphere departments from the previous ones, but one that takes a gigantic step. And one of my go-to for my counter-argument to people who complain about the backtracking because of how different this one is from your previous visit. The Ancient Cistern. A dungeon that I initially struggled navigating through in my first playthrough, but came to greatly appreciate once I got the hang of it. While this too is the usual ancient temple that most dungeons fall under, initially seeming to be the opposite of before, is completely made up for by having its own unique spin on that front, taking inspiration from East Asian temples, with the whole dungeon being themed around Buddhism. The central room that is its focal point is so pretty, even on the Wii. It almost looks like it could pass off as a spa, you know, if there weren't all these enemies around. The main puzzle here is raising and lowering the huge Buddha statue in the center to unlock new rooms to reach, slightly reminiscent of the dreaded water temple, and is why I initially struggled with this place. But ultimately, it's more of a slight hurdle to overcome to encounter the good challenges found throughout here. And it's nowhere near as commonplace as changing the water level in the water temple. Here, the water-based puzzles involve the likes of opening drains, creating geysers to reach higher areas, and riding on lily pads, which are far less confusing. Primarily utilizing the whip alongside other actions like swinging to make the most of its uses for its introduction. However, things take a drastic turn when you're pretty much flushed down into the basement. The complete opposite of what's above. It's this dark underworld filled with cursed enemies and many more hazards, as it's based on the many hells in Buddhism, emphasizing how they went all out with the Buddhist theme here, and is completed by the end goal of raising the statue to its highest point and climbing up it to metaphorically reach Nirvana, or instead fight a giant Asura statue. The Koloktos fight is so much fun, because you get to take its giant cutlasses and use them against it to absolutely tear them apart, both figuratively and literally, giving you such a strong power trip as you do so. It just goes to show how far a fully fleshed out theme and its influences on the gameplay go to make playing through a dungeon a truly memorable experience. If you haven't already figured this out by now, I really like Twilight Princess's dungeons. I can't help myself, cause it probably has my overall favorite lineup of dungeons in the series, since all of them have really stuck with me ever since my first playthrough. To the point that even when stacked up against the rest of the series, it still makes up roughly a third of the list. And this entry only further demonstrates my aforementioned remark on how I feel the dungeons progressively get better overall. As after finishing a rather lengthy quest just to get to this dungeon, it becomes well worth it in the end as you reach both the high point of the dungeons and the highest point in the world. The City in the Sky. For the setting, it is a city in the sky before Skyward Sword. Not only does it use the more uncommon sky theme, particularly at the time of release, to help it stand out theme-wise, but it also contains that unique feel to it previously seen at Snow Peak, just with a different approach and some subtle build-up towards this location. You've been running into Uka in all the previous dungeons. Now here you get to learn about the entire Uku race she comes from and gain glimpses into their civilization. The city is far more technologically advanced than the rest of this version of Hyrule, but the make and visual design of their machinery still has this slight, ancient feel to it, so it doesn't come off as jarringly out of place. I absolutely love this dungeon's aesthetic. And while it doesn't exactly have the same laid-back feel from Snow Peak due to there being far more dangers throughout, you still get small hints of the city feel at times, such as the beginning where there's a shop, and coming across other Uku at various points, some of which you're even required to carry for traversal, including the background music being made up of the Uku's weird humming. Even the outside portions gives me the impression that this place was once very serene before being overrun, in contrast to this dungeon posing quite a challenge, but still a fun one. Not just from having some of the tougher enemies in the game, but hazards like the many chances to fall out of the sky, and the strong winds both inside and out to push you around, and many instances of tight platforming that is made trickier by combining those obstacles, in which you have to overcome these challenges and its puzzles by actually using quite a few of your previously obtained items, which doesn't happen all too often in the series outside of staples like the bow. However, this dungeon's own item still takes center stage. The hookshot / claw shot is one of my favorite items in the series, and the city in the sky answers the unspoken question of, what if there were two? You get the double claw shot, which doubles its already high effectiveness by now allowing you to claw shot from one target to another in continuous succession to act like Spider-Man, by climbing across walls and navigating through rooms in ways you can only dream of in other games. The double claw shot's uses are fully realized here and for the rest of the game, as you make it across the unique layout of the city spanning across multiple flying islands and these huge vertical shafts. That remains true for the boss, who is also built up towards throughout this place. Argarok. Another one of the easiest bosses in the game, but the fight is so much fun and epic that I hardly care and is one of my favorites regardless. Taking on this armored, fire-breathing dragon at the very top of the city, way high in the sky, by first pulling him down with your weight to tear off his armor, then as the sky becomes dark and stormy, quickly claw-shotting away from his fire to latch on and attack his back to send him crashing into the ground. To finish the quest to recover the Mirror of Twilight's pieces, you have to play through a dungeon with such a unique, interesting, and truly atmospheric setting with its own fascinating world building reflected in its layout, an exciting challenge of both obstacles and puzzles that makes use of a lot of your arsenal, an awesome item that further complements its other aspects, and a really fun boss fight to end it off on. Which is why the City in the Sky is one of the first dungeons that come to mind when I think of Twilight Princesses, and even the whole series dungeons, which in the end is what makes it take the place of my favorite of them all.